it is possible to downscale the use of natural resources in wealthy countries while improving social well-being and economic equality. So the central proposition of degrowth is that it's not just that the correlation between GDP and the human welfare breaks down after a certain point, but it is also that more GDP growth begins to have a negative impact after a certain point. So the continued pursuit of growth in high-income nations is now actively driving inequality, political instability, and the ecological crisis.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been warned. It's time to figure out the climate crisis with the top scientists, activists, and entrepreneurs helping us get out of this mess. Now let's welcome your host, Dragos, in 3, 2, 1.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of You've Been Warned. I've been a bit absent lately since the entire COVID-19 situation happened. Now that that's behind us and the measures are a bit more relaxed, I'll continue publishing podcast episodes that I've recorded before and continue to talk to new guests. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of talking to Riccardo Mastini. Riccardo is a PhD candidate in political ecology and ecological economics at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. The topic sounded extremely interesting, particularly since Riccardo is at the forefront of academic research into degrowth, the idea that we need to transform our society to optimize the well-being of everybody and sustain the natural basis of life. Apart from studying degrowth, Riccardo is a member of the Green New Deal for Europe and the Well-Being Economic Alliance. He has also consulted the United Nations Environment Programme, several environmental agencies across the world, and a lot of international NGOs. Our podcast was quite detailed and had an academic feel to it. It does require a bit of focus, but the explanations are so nuanced and in-depth that it's a worthy listen. We discussed how his PhD intersects with climate change. We delved deeper into degrowth. We looked at why we cannot continue to grow and decarbonize at the same time, at a meaningful rate anyway, and we explored the intricacies of the Green New Deal with a focus on Europe. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Let's dive right in. So I'm joined now by Riccardo. Hey Riccardo, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for being on here. I was super excited to talk to you ever since I saw Jason's tweet and I saw what you're working on, because I haven't actually spoken to someone about these ideas so far. I mean, I've kind of spoken to about similar stuff, but not about degrowth in particular. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And at the same time, it's really interesting because we're both in total lockdown as we're recording this. You're in Barcelona, I'm in Bucharest. So what else to do with our time than create content? I'm super excited because there's so many questions that I can ask on all those topics, because I can see, I mean, just by mentioning political ecology and how you study politics and economics combined with ecology, I think that's exactly what we need right now, the kind of approach that we need to implement right now in the entire world. But obviously our imperative right now is, by all accounts, the profit motive and the growth motive, which you see cited everywhere. I mean, even amongst, and I know we'll talk about COVID-19 a bit later, but even amidst this entire pandemic, decision makers, especially in the US, are eternally concerned with the economy and how it's going to affect growth and so on. So I'm really interested in this idea of degrowth, and also how you view this just transition while taking into account climate change. But first, tell us a bit about degrowth, kind of maybe categorize it or define it for us, because I know that's the main activity of your studies, and I want to understand it a bit better.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that degrowth is a theory affirming that it is possible to downscale the use of natural resources in wealthy countries while improving social well-being and economic equality. So the central proposition of degrowth is that it's not just that the correlation between GDP and the human welfare breaks down after a certain point, but it is also that more GDP growth begins to have a negative impact after a certain point. So the continued pursuit of growth in high-income nations is now actively driving inequality, political instability, and the ecological crisis. So after a certain point, growth begins to be uneconomic, meaning it begins to create more problems than wealth. And most industrialized countries hit this point around the end of the 70s and have seen no net progress in their welfare indicators in the half century since. So the truth is that the interventions that matter when it comes to improving human welfare do not require high levels of GDP. Proof of that is that the European Union as a whole has 36% less income than the United States, and yet beats the US not only on life expectancy, but on virtually every indicator of human welfare. But there are even countries that are usually defined as developing countries that manage to achieve high levels of human welfare with low GDP per capita. Let's take Costa Rica as an example, which surpasses the United States on many welfare indicators with a GDP per capita that is only 1/7 that of the US. And I mean, you may wonder what explains such remarkable results. Well, I would say that when it comes to delivering long, healthy, flourishing lives for all, what counts is investing in high-quality, universal public services, which are significantly more cost-efficient to run than their private counterparts. And instead, since the 80s, endless waves of privatization have been unleashed all over the world. Privatization of education, healthcare, transportation, housing, even social security. So social goods everywhere are under attack for the sake of growth. And this is a purposeful strategy. The idea is that by making public goods artificially scarce, people will have no choice but to purchase private alternatives, meaning that they end up paying to acquire goods that they used to access for free. And what happens when you enclose the good that used to be accessed for free by the people? Well, GDP grows. GDP grows because money changes hands. And GDP growth is ultimately an indicator of the welfare of capital. But over the past few decades, we have all come to see it as a proxy for the welfare of the rest of us, and therefore to pursue it with single-minded zeal. And this mental shift really represents an extraordinary coup on the part of capital accumulators. What happens is that when you enclose public goods, you create artificial scarcity. Hence, scarcity and growth create a self-reinforcing loop, meaning to stimulate growth, you need to enclose public goods. And then to have the means to access these public goods, you need to have growth. However, if this is true, as the theory of degrowth postulates, then also the reverse then must be possible, meaning that if scarcity is created for the sake of growth, then by reversing this artificial scarcity for public goods, we can render growth unnecessary. Basically, by de-enclosing and expanding the commons, we can enable people to access the goods that they need to live well without needing high levels of income and therefore additional growth. Basically, people would be able to work less without any loss to their quality of life. And they would, as a consequence, also produce less unnecessary stuff and generating less pressure on the biosphere. It's true that the economy would be smaller in terms of GDP, and yet it would be more abundant in terms of welfare since we have decoupled the two. In a nutshell, we could say that degrowth calls for abundance in order to render growth unnecessary. And we can discuss this more later, but since we have so far clearly failed in decoupling GDP from resources and energy use, so what we should really aim for now is decoupling human progress from GDP growth.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense from what I'm hearing. I wanted to ask you a kind of like a follow-up question. When you say all the welfare metrics, can you give us some examples just so we understand like the kind of metrics that some of these countries, you mentioned Costa Rica, are ranking at the same level or better than the US, for example, even though they have much less GDP? So you mentioned life expectancy. What kind of other things do you look at in these studies?
Well, for example, yes, access to healthcare and access to education, infant mortality. I mean, another country that performs quite well on these indicators. So I would say that the genuine progress index is probably the best indicator we should use for assessing human welfare. And then you see that certain countries, such as Vietnam, Costa Rica, Cuba, Georgia, actually have very high levels of human welfare with very low income per capita. I mean, even the mortality rate of the infant mortality rate of Cuba is lower than the United States, not to speak access to education. And so this also is usually correlated with the lower ecological footprint per capita. This not just because the purchasing power per capita is lower, so let's say there is less disposable income for consumption goods that then, of course, don't necessarily increase welfare, are just part of our throwaway society obsessed with consumption. But the point is also that public provisioning of these services, so healthcare, education, social security, it's usually less ecological intensive when these are public rather than private, because you can imagine economies of scale, because of the fact that you don't have the inefficiency that at times is driven by the profit motive in providing these basic services.
Interesting. And if you mentioned Europe, if you were to look at a country that performs well in these metrics in Europe, I mean, I kind of have a guess, but I'll ask you to tell us which ones perform the best.
Well, I would say that on these welfare indicators, Scandinavian countries perform better than the rest of the EU. However, their ecological footprint is also quite high, so it becomes quite tricky, because then at this point we need to look to intersect two different metrics. One for in order to envision what a post-growth desirable society could look like. So we need somehow to put two metrics into relation. So one on the ecological footprint and one on human welfare. And the Scandinavian countries are quite high ecological footprint. Anyway, there is this very interesting study which motivated also the author to create this interactive website, and that can be included in the link in the links at the bottom of our podcast conversation, which is called A Good Life for All, in which basically you can look at a plot where countries are plotted based on these combined indicators, and you can also play with them. So compare one country with another and figure out which actually welfare indicators can be achieved with a very little increase in ecological footprint, and which others instead are more environmentally intensive. So that's actually a pretty good resource for understanding which countries somehow point to some models that are viable and that we could maybe look at to try and replicate.
I'll definitely have a look at that model after we speak, because it sounds really interesting. Tell me about degrowth when it comes to decarbonization. So why do we need degrowth in order to, let's say, tackle climate change? And why do you think we cannot grow and decarbonize at the same time? Because I see on climate Twitter especially, I see some people who argue that we're already kind of decoupling our emissions from our GDP. So why do you think that's not possible?
Right. So I'll start by giving you a figure which sets the scene for the conversation we should have when we talk about the current ecological breakdown. So if the global economy continues to grow at the usual rate of 2-3% per year, then in the next 30 years, we will consume as much energy and materials as we did cumulatively for the past 10,000 years. So just to get a sense of the magnitude of the current levels of global consumption. So the key thing to grasp here is that the increasing material and energy use tracks more or less exactly with the rise of global GDP. The two have grown together in lockstep. Every additional unit of GDP growth means an additional unit of material extraction. True that there were times, such as during the 90s, when GDP grew at a slightly faster rate than material use, prompting some at the time to hope that we were on our way to decoupling GDP from material use altogether. But those hopes have been thoroughly dashed in the decades since. In fact, exactly the opposite has been happening. Since the year 2000, the growth of material use has outpaced the growth of GDP at the global level. So instead of gradually dematerializing, the global economy has been rematerializing. And because GDP growth is driving energy demand up at such a rapid pace, renewable energy is not replacing fossil fuels, but it is being added on top of them.
Yeah,
for instance,
I've seen that.
Just to take an example, today the world is producing 8 billion more megawatt hours of clean energy each year than in the year 2000. 8 billion. That's a lot. That's enough to power all of Russia. But over exactly the same period, meaning since the year 2000, economic growth has caused energy demand to increase by 48 billion megawatt hours. So 8 billion megawatt hours of clean energy compared to 48 billion megawatt hours of overall energy consumption. So in other words, all the clean energy we have been rolling out covers only a small fraction of new demand. With business as usual growth, the global economy is set to roughly triple in size by the middle of the century. That's 3 times more extraction and production and consumption than we are presently doing. And all of which will suck up nearly 3 times as much end-use energy. So it is extremely difficult for us to decarbonize the existing global economy at the present level, given the very limited remaining carbon budget we have, but it will be simply impossible to do it 3 times over. So it would require a rate of decarbonization of the global economy of 12% per year. And that's 5 times faster than the historical rate of decarbonization and 3 times faster what scientists project as achievable even under highly optimistic conditions.
So when you say, sorry for interrupting you, when you say 3 times higher, is that basically with scientists assuming that we would adopt renewables at a really fast pace and replace fossil fuels? Is that what you mean?
Yes, exactly. So models considering energy efficiency and very high rate of renewable energy rollout, they envision that we can achieve more or less 4% rates of 4% decarbonization per year. So if now we are growing the global economy 3 times by the mid of the century, we would need 12% per year decarbonization rate. So yes, 3 times that.
Wow.
Yeah, but another point that I would like to make is that the vast majority of energy is consumed not by households, but by industry. So the best way to reduce energy use is to focus not on energy itself, but on the material throughput, basically the material metabolism of our economy. So it might seem counterintuitive that the solution to the problem of emissions has to do with materials. However, what's so brilliant about downscaling material use is that it helps us solve not only the climate crisis, basically by making it possible to achieve a rapid transition to renewables, but also to solve all the other dimensions of ecological breakdown, meaning deforestation, biodiversity collapse, etc., which in turn are caused by excess material extraction and waste. So this is, I would say, an ecological coherent solution. And some recent studies have put forward an incredible amount of empirical evidence proving that decoupling of economic growth from environmental pressures anywhere near the scale needed to deal with the ecological crisis is not happening. But what is really striking in these studies is that what is more problematic is that they show that such decoupling appears unlikely to happen even in the future. The two most robust scientific publications explaining this are Decoupling Debunked, which is a report published by the European Environmental Bureau, and the peer-reviewed paper Is Green Growth Possible? And we might add the links to these publications as well on the podcast webpage. So the point is that we should not content ourselves with, let's say, a theoretical discussion on whether decoupling is possible. Of course, a certain degree of decoupling happens. I mean, that's really what drives capitalism. The point is that relative decoupling is not good enough. Relative decoupling means that, let's say, the economy grows at a faster rate than the material metabolism of the economy. So if you were to plot it on a chart, you would basically see that they diverge slowly, but they still go up. Whereas what we need is absolute decoupling, a decoupling where basically the graph of material consumption goes down, while in theory, if that's possible, which I doubt that, let's say the economy grows. And so when I see some debates about like, oh, but decoupling is actually happening, well, the point is that we need a very specific rate of decoupling because we know that it's a race against time given the carbon budget we have left.
Exactly. And if you take into account all the developing countries which are going to grow their economies, and right now they're doing that using fossil fuels, then I can understand how, even if economic growth might not seem to happen that fast in the Western world, it's probably happening very fast in Africa and parts of Asia. And all of that will bring with it a certain amount of material use as well. And I understand your point that if the decoupling is not as fast as to actually start taking that material throughput down overall, then it's not what's necessary. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we should always look at the global level. And so at times there can be some accounting tricks, so to speak, of kind of outsourcing emission and carbon leakage. So we should really look at the global level, yes. And well, I mean, just to conclude, I wanted to say that these considerations have led an increasingly high number of scientists to recognize the importance of downscaling our use of energy and materials in order to address the ecological crisis. And just to give a few examples of this, we could mention the open letter signed by more than 200 scholars that was published by several major European newspapers in September 2018, or the statement published in the journal Bioscience last January and endorsed by 11,000 scientists, declaring that the climate crisis is closely linked to excessive consumption of the wealthy lifestyle. Or even the IPCC is increasingly on board on this, because when they released their low energy demand scenario developed in 2018, basically they envisioned that reducing energy demand at the global level by 40% by 2050 was necessary to stay within the carbon budget and meet the Paris Agreement targets without relying on speculative negative emissions technologies, which are still unproven at scale and represent a moral hazard. And also the upcoming IPCC sixth assessment report, which will be published soon, has a full chapter devoted to degrowing energy demand and material throughput as key strategies for averting climate breakdown. So the point I'm trying to get across here is that degrowth is not a fringe idea anymore, and it enjoys a strengthening scientific consensus.
Well, if we go through this entire COVID-19 pandemic where we don't grow economically, and I mean, obviously it'll be a pretty bad period for a lot of people, but if we actually survive it, then maybe the on the other end of the tunnel we're going to be better off by taking into account by seeing that it's possible without eternal economic growth. I wanted to ask you, okay, I understand the situation where we are and where we need to be headed, but in that sense, what are the solutions? How do you see this playing out? What do you think we should focus on? And I guess my question more so relates to what I think is one of the main ideas that is being floated around, both in the US and in Europe, is that of the Green New Deal. So let's talk specifically, because I know you work on it or you advise on it. How do you think the Green New Deal affects or can impact the ecological crisis that we're facing? And also, can you address some of the criticisms that people, because I know people have brought a lot of criticism to I'm talking here about the European Green New Deal, by saying that it's not ambitious enough, etc. So what's your take when it comes to that?
Right. Yeah, well, I agree with you that the Green New Deal is definitely the dominant discourse at the moment on the ecological transition. However, the banner of the Green New Deal has been appropriated by so many different movements and political parties lately that it is difficult to agree on what it actually stands for. However, I would say that in its most radical articulations, it prescribes the need for an active role of an entrepreneurial state in the economy to, well, first of all, finance and coordinate expensive and unprofitable investments in the short term to transform the national infrastructure system. And secondly, extend the time horizon of the private sector, which today is characterized by a short-term perspective. So the importance of public investment and public coordination is the heart of it. However, those advocating for a radical Green New Deal recognize also the importance of public regulation. This means moving beyond market-based environmental policies instruments, such as tax incentives, price signals, to nudge businesses to change production methods or citizens to change consumption habits, and actually fully embracing command and control regulation to set clear standards, technological standards, but also to set clear limits to what cannot be produced or sold for the sake of a rapid decarbonization. So all this represents a historic break from the neoliberal dogma that has reigned over the world for the past 30 years. And so, in my opinion, the Green New Deal is without a doubt a step in the right direction. However, given all the things we discussed about before, it's clear to me that a truly transformative Green New Deal cannot simply be about returning to a welfare capitalist order of the post-war economic boom. We need to think beyond that. So building solar panels and wind turbines is a transitional strategy, which might lead to the growth of certain economic sectors for a limited amount of time. But continuous growth should not be the objective of the Green New Deal. Well, so since we agree that the Green New Deal is really the most debated progressive policy when it comes to climate and ecology, then I think that what the degrowth movement should do is try to engage constructively with this discourse. And I think that there are some valuable proposals that degrowth can bring to the Green New Deal discourse. And I would mention like three or four. So the first one is that given the rapidly shrinking carbon budget and given how slowly we are proceeding in decarbonizing the energy system, we need to reduce aggregate energy demand at a global level. And this can be achieved with a gradually declining cap on energy use. And this also makes sense because we know that renewable energy technology is material intensive. So while wind and solar radiation are indeed clean energy sources, the technology we use to harness them require high amounts of minerals and metals. And this is all the more problematic because lots of extraction will largely happen in global south communities. So replacing a rapacious fossil fuel industry with an equally predatory renewables industry is not in line with the principles of environmental justice. So if we don't take precautions, clean energy firms could become as destructive as fossil fuel companies, like buying off politicians, trashing ecosystem, lobbying against environmental regulations, even assassinating community leaders who stand in their way. For example, I think that there are good reasons to believe that the coup d'etat against Bolivian President Evo Morales was motivated by foreign interest into the rich lithium reserves of the country. And we know that lithium is indispensable for electric batteries. So a renewable energy industry that pursues endless growth will just become, by definition, as destructive as the fossil fuel industry. Because here the issue is not so much the energy source per se, it's just the fact that we are trying to expand production, consumption, and infrastructures endlessly. Well, another dimension of a radical Green New Deal, which has a strong echo with Degrowth, is that we should shift income and welfare creation from industrial production and towards social and environmental reproduction. So this means an increased role of work focused on the maintenance, recycling, and repair of the built environment, just like an increased role of work focused on the restoration of habitats and on care activities for people, such as education, medical support to an aging population, and community service. So a shift away from production towards reproduction. And in terms of employment policies, the proposal for a job guarantee is being widely discussed both in the Green New Deal and the growth communities. And a job guarantee is a very promising proposal, in my opinion, because it enables full employment despite contracting aggregate economic activity, and it creates the possibility for people to earn a living outside the sphere of capital. So the activities of social and environmental reproduction I mentioned before are often neglected by the private sector because they have low economic returns. And instead, work that is provided by the government through the job guarantee can be channeled toward any activity that is deemed socially desirable, since it involves production for use rather than exchange. And since we're speaking of work, I think another important policy to reduce the time that people devoted to salary work is work time reduction. So I think that this is an important one, since the fact that we overconsume resources is just the other side of the coin of the fact that we are overworked. If we consume too much, it's because we produce too much. So I would say that what we need is to work less, consume less, and live better lives. And I would like to discuss a couple more if we have time, because something that I think is very relevant is also the decommodification of basic services, which echoes what I was saying when I was talking about human welfare and how that is at the core of the growth analysis. So in order to decarbonize essential services, meaning the way we move, what we eat, how we supply energy and the heating to our homes, well, we should remove these basic services from the market logic and subject them to the logic of the commons. As I was saying before, One important reason why decommodification and decarbonization should proceed in lockstep is because the consumption of public services has a lower environmental impact than their private equivalents. But even more crucial than that is the fact that reducing dependence on individual consumer goods mitigates competition for social status and consequently does a lot to counteract consumerism. The proof of this is that the more unequal societies tend to have higher levels of average emissions per capita. And this is because of so-called positional consumption. So more unequal a society is, the more important is our consumption because somehow it helps us rank ourselves within this highly unequal society. So if we know that purchasing power correlates with personal environmental impacts, we must find a way to, reduce outlets in which its destructive powers can be unleashed. And I would say that positional consumption is the most perverse form in which purchasing power manifests itself. And just to conclude, with regard to, let's say, what I theorize as a radical Green New Deal is that we cannot content ourselves with the more direct role of the state in the economy, so the entrepreneurial state I was mentioning before, but we must also democratize the workplace to win social power over material production. So we know that it is not so much demand that influences supply, but rather the concentration of the means of production that determines demand. So all the talk about consumer sovereignty and vote with your wallet, I think it has very clear limits as a transformative strategy, because few large multinational companies and financial groups control the direction of the economy. They choose the activities in which to invest and those to be abandoned. They choose the regions in which to place factories and those to be deindustrialized, the technologies to be used, the contracts and wages to be offered, prices for consumers, and also the environmental impacts from production. So democratizing economic production means, first of all, involving in industrial decision-making all those who must live with the consequences of production choices. And this means local communities, consumer associations, and workers. Now, since you asked me also about the European Green Deal, well, it's pretty obvious to me that the European Commission's vision is not in line with what we have discussed so far. But apart from that, there are some specific elements of the European Green Deal that I'd like to discuss, since I've been investigating them also for my academic research. So, first of all, it's the stated goal of the European Green Deal is to achieve climate neutrality for the European Union by 2050, with the intermediate goal by 2030 of reducing emissions by 55% compared to 1990 levels. But this is really the basement of climate ambition. I mean, true that the objective of decarbonizing by 2050 is based on the climate models developed by the IPCC, but this target is a global target, and it must then be modulated according to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities.
And also, I might add the 2050 net neutrality target is in line with 2 degrees warming, right? It's not 1.5. Exactly. We're not even talking about 1.5. Like, that's out the window.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's really the basement of climate ambition, really, yes. And the point is that, so there is an historical responsibilities of wealthy nations for basically filling most of the carbon budget that we have. And so, basically, we need a much faster rate of decarbonization in order to leave more of the remaining carbon budget to countries in the global south that do need to increase some of their material consumption in order to meet basic development. So I think that in light of this consideration, the Green New Deal proposal articulated in the US by Ocasio-Cortez is very valid, as it sets 2030 as a target for decarbonizing entirely the American economy, and the European Union should aim for the same target. And so, speaking of the European Green Deal, the second point I like to make is that while it is legitimate to argue that an ambitious decarbonization project can be more easily undertaken at the European level than at the national level, it is equally necessary to recognize that the neoliberal architecture of the European treaties clashes with the welfarism and dirigism at the heart of the Green New Deal. So proof of that is that the funding allocated by the European Green Deal amounts to just 1 trillion euros between now and 2030. And we know that in investment, at least 10 times higher is actually needed. But even more worrying than that is that of this 1 trillion euro, only a tiny part comes from the European Union budget, while the rest will have to be contributed by member states. But this, in turn, raises a crucial question. Will the austerity rules limiting deficit spending will be reconsidered? Because if this were not the case, then member states could be forced to finance the ecological transition with cuts in their welfare spending, which is obviously goes against everything that the Green New Deal should stand for. And
I wanted to just to interject a bit. By comparison, if you look at Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren's proposed Green New Deals, I think the cost of those is much higher, right? I think Bernie's at least is around 10, 15 trillion.
Yeah.
By 2030, something like that. So 10, 15 times higher than the one proposed in the EU. But I guess on the flip side, at least the European Green New Deal seems like it's going to be implemented and passed, whereas in the US, they're nowhere near that. So there's that as well.
That's yes, indeed, and I mean, I think that the fact that the new European Commission has, demonstrating willingness to engage with this debate is surely a positive step. But I think that this is also why it's so important that progressives all across the continent jump on these opportunities and trying to radicalize their demands for a Green New Deal. And also because there are other disturbing elements, I think, in the European Commission proposals. And one of these is the, let's say, public-private partnership model for investments. So the basic idea here is to attract the private financing to build renewable energy plants through a public guarantee issued by the European Investment Bank that cover costs in case of failures of the project. So this really is the old logic of privatizing profits and socializing losses. So the public-private partnership allows private individuals to bear only the variable costs of a project while leaving the public to bear the fixed cost. So and equally infuriating is the fact that the European Green Deal proposed to further pursue the path of liberalization of the energy sector that has been undertaken for the past 20 years in the EU, and which is to be considered bankrupt both at the social and the environmental level. So here I think that we really miss completely the New Deal element. I mean, any reference to the original Roosevelt's New Deal plan, which was the one of the government investing, the government planning, the government coordinating, is being completely thrown out of the window. Here we just have the public purse open then for private interest supposedly to tap into it, and the private purse that, as I said, is not even big enough. So I think that I see very little value in the way it's been articulated so far, and so I think it's important that we mount constructive criticism and trying to radicalize it.
Very interesting. I haven't spoken to someone about the Green New Deal in that much detail, so it's very interesting to hear a point. since we're kind of short on time, I wanted to go to the last question. And I guess we've been speaking about this whole situation kind of from a vantage point. But if there's people listening right now, based in the EU or the US, who are asking themselves, how they can contribute, what would you say? And this is a question that I ask everyone: is the importance of policy versus society getting involved, versus businesses and their responsibility, and versus scientific research and innovation. And I guess based on your answer as to how these four forces intersect, people can kind of tell where they can contribute, whether they're part of a business, whether they can get involved politically or vote, or whether they can contribute through their activism, through their lifestyle changes, civil disobedience, etc. So if you were to rank those sectors 1 through 4 in terms of their importance, what would you say?
All right, so I would rank first society in the sense of activism and civil disobedience more than lifestyle changes. Because as I said before, I think that there are limits with this vision of lifestyle changes. But I would say that so from a societal point of view, as engaged citizens or activists, I think we have to bear in mind that the states act autonomously and discipline capital only when the establishment feels threatened. So political elites must be targeted by movements and made to feel threatened enough in their, let's say, in their control of hegemonic discourse in order to push them to exercise the state's relative autonomy to capital's short-term prerogatives. And also in this respect, the New Deal is an interesting historical precedent because the New Deal was not the result of Roosevelt's concerns over the economic and social costs of the Great Depression, but it was rather the power of organized labor and social protest that left the government with no choice but to act. Unions' mobilization was at all-time high after the Great Depression. And for this to happen again, progressive need to place the state front and center in their strategic considerations. So let's say movements, activist groups that, let's say, resort to strategies as calling for corporate social responsibility or attempt to shame capital into reform, or declare politics broken and they just want to circumvent the state, or even escapist hyperlocalism, I think are fundamentally unrealistic strategies for the task at hand. And this, of course, makes me place politics and policy at the second place in this ranking, because I think that the history of capitalist development has always been the history of state-guided development. I mean, the entrepreneurial state we referred to before. So I think that we need strong governmental financing and coordination and regulation in order to pursue a radical decarbonization, but that will happen only if there is bottom-up pressure for this to happen. And this leaves me more in doubt about the ranking between scientific research / innovation and businesses. I would say that if I were to rank them, I would still place scientific research ahead of business. Because surely there is still a considerable amount of, let's say, technological improvement that we can aim for, but at the same time, I am a bit skeptical of this, in the sense we should not fall into the trap of stalling to adopt the policy measures simply because we are, waiting for the right technologies to come around, or we are waiting for the silver bullet that will make the transition. a simple exercise, let's say, in technocracy. I mean, I think that lots of the technology is already here. It's just a
That's
matter that
if there's one line, sorry to interrupt, if there's one line that I hear over and over again when I ask this question, it's literally almost everyone says, look, the technology and the science is there. We literally could change this entire situation without any more advancements in technology. We have everything we need, save for, let's say, a bit of improvement in batteries and a few fringe improvements here and there. We have everything we need. It's actually the other areas that need to work together.
yeah,
So yeah, sorry, carry on.
definitely. No, yeah. And yes, well, when it comes to business, I mean, surely it's I mean, they drive also innovation, and I think there are also looking back at let's say Green New Deal period, the war economy period. I think that of course business can be greatly innovative when it receives the right incentive and so on, but at the same time I think we also need to rethink business deeply, in the sense that we definitely need to move beyond the profit motive in order to motivate business activity. So we need to widen the perspective of business to take into consideration, of course, people and planet. And so in the longer run, we should probably also reconsider the whole model of business and moving more towards, let's say, a no-profit cooperative model of producing wealth that is localized, it's embedded in a local community, it's part of a more vibrant, let's say, political and social life where everybody can contribute. So in the longer run, I see a transformation of business beyond, let's say, the profit motive for sure.
Got it. That's a very comprehensive view, and yeah, it's very interesting. I also think it starts society. One interesting note that I would make on the lifestyle changes, and it's kind of switched my view on it as well. Is there's a lot of studies that people actually psychologically react and change their behaviors when other people change their behaviors as well. So in a sense, convincing other people to care about the climate change situation we're in is actually letting your actions speak. I think that's why Greta, for example, is so powerful in her message, because she actually lives through her message. So she doesn't fly, she doesn't do all these different things, and that actually amplifies the effect that what she says has, which I think is quite an interesting view. So yeah, obviously in terms of individual lifestyle changes don't make a change in terms of numbers, let's say, but they actually help influence other people to do the same thing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, on that I agree with you. I mean, I think that, of course, we are social beings, political animals. So I totally agree with you that we receive a very strong, we are subject to a very strong influence from the environment around us, how people around us behave. So indeed, if we think of lifestyle changes as going beyond just, let's say, voting with your wallet, and it has to do with, with an ethical commitment to specific lifestyles that are ethical, then at that point, I agree with you that it can be very powerful. And I think we are witnessing this in this very moment with the fly shame movement that is expanding, especially in Northern Europe. So we see people taking more trains than flights, in spite of all economic incentives going in the opposite direction. And I think that then, of course, that interacts also with policy, because it sends a very strong signals to policymakers that they should reconsider the economic incentives that make flights so cheap compared to trains, while this makes no sense from an environmental point of view. So, of course, these elements that we discussed in silos are inevitably interlinked,
Yeah.
and they interact. And this is, I think, how change comes about.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And the question is kind of like a trick question, because obviously you can't just like clearly rank them and say one is more important than the other. They obviously all interact, but it's interesting to see how people frame these dependencies. All right. Thank you so much, Ricardo.